All right, here we go. Evolution part 2. So this is the very last PowerPoint for the term. And in essence, it is about the 5 mechanisms of evolution. If you remember the last time I was explaining how Darwin figured out the concept of natural selection and how populations change over time. And he was pretty sure that that led directly to speciation. And it can, but it doesn't necessarily. And so he pretty much figured out microevolution, change in populations over time, but not speciation, which is macroevolution. And in our modern synthesis of the theory of evolution, we have a bigger picture understanding of these 5 mechanisms of evolution. Based on what Darwin did, based on what Mendel did, based on our discovery of DNA structure and our understanding of what happens during meiosis and how homologous chromosomes separate during that process. And so what I want to do is talk about these 5 mechanisms. And if you see this note here down at the bottom, we can define 5 different ways in which evolution occurs based on the situations in which these 5 assumptions are not met. And each one is a result of a violation of one or more of the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So Hardy and Weinberg were 2 scientists who were trying to figure out what does it mean for a population to evolve and what does it mean for it to not be evolving. And basically what they came up with was an equation that explained that if a population is not evolving, then that means there's no mutation in the DNA that's inherited, passed on from parent generation to offspring generation. There's no allele or gene flow, which means populations are isolated. A group of lizards on one side of the mountain isn't traveling to the other side of the mountain and mating with lizards on the other side. So number 2 is about isolation of populations so that the genes in a population stay in that population from one generation to the next. 3 says that, hey, the environment, if the environment is not choosing one allele over the other as far as an advantage, it's not choosing snakes that can blend into the background to be able to hide better from predators or to hide better from prey and eat more. If there's nothing like that going on, then there's no natural selection, so there's no change from one generation to the next based on the environment selecting for what's good or bad, or useful and not useful. And then number 4, genetic drift, is about from one generation to another if which alleles of a given chromosome end up in a gamete is totally random, then it's possible that a particular egg might have a recessive allele and it might not. And if the eggs and sperm that become zygotes and become the next generation randomly don't have an allele that was less common in the parent generation, then that allele could just plain disappear. Would be interesting, 10,000 years ago was 6 fingers more common than it is today. What happened to that allele, right? So the assumption of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is that there's no change from one generation to the other in the alleles present in the population. And number 5, non-random mating, this is the Hardy-Weinberg assumption that any egg can meet up with any sperm and that the adult population is not exhibiting choice in who their mates are. So can you imagine a situation in which DNA doesn't get mutated and passed on? Can you imagine a situation in which populations are completely cut off from other populations and there's no interaction whatsoever? Can you imagine a situation in which the environment doesn't play a role in the survival of a group of organisms? Can you imagine a situation in which every single egg and every single sperm that goes into mating has the, you know, the exact same alleles. And number 5, can you imagine a situation in which there's no mate choice? Well, if you can imagine all of that, then you've just imagined Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And
what if you can't imagine any of that?
It's true. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is this like zero-sum point of reference. It's not realistic, but it's a point of reference to say, well, if none of these things were happening, then there'd be no evolution. The truth is, there's always changes in DNA from one generation to the next. Depending on the group of organisms, depending on the chromosome, the rate of mutation can be greater or less. And you know, populations exposed to like more radiation, things like that, that's more mutation during the organism's lifetime. We're talking about the mutation rate when meiosis happens and the DNA is replicated prior to producing gametes. There's corrective mechanisms that correct for mutation, but mutation nonetheless occurs. And allele flow, there are instances where populations are completely cut off on an island, right? Or on an iceberg or what have you. But usually the way we reduce differences between populations is with allele flow, with a few members managing to move from one population to another, and then being able to reproduce. And so the allele, they bring fresh alleles into the population that they come to, and that helps alleles not disappear. And it also, it has an impact on the rate of evolution, sometimes increasing it, sometimes decreasing it. But it's not very realistic to say that populations are completely isolated. Natural selection, since when does the environment never impact what's going on to organisms? Well, it does. You know, the dinosaurs are a big example, right? But the way that humans are accelerating global warming and the rate of climate change, we're basically in a 6th mass extinction event that's based, at least in part, on humans, and the environment is selecting for organisms that have the ability to move locations, and also that have a high enough rate of mutation to come up with adaptations that help them survive the environmental changes that are occurring. Number 4, genetic drift. There's no way, if you did a mathematical model, that you could come up with any kind of model that was realistic that showed that genes don't occasionally disappear just based on which egg is fertilized by which sperm with the random alleles. And this is based on independent assortment when we're looking at, you know, meiosis. It's well known. And then non-random mating. Those of you with kids, would you want to just have had, you know, pick a name out of a hat and have kids with that person, right? So humans, there's not non-random mating. Well, there's not much non-random mating in birds and other organisms either. There's very often mate selection and sexual selection that is going on there. So basically, Hardy and Weinberg came up with a set of rules that said, okay, if these all existed like this and nothing was happening, then there'd be no evolution. But the truth be told, there's always something happening in one or more of these categories, which means what is always happening? Evolution. There's always a change in genes from one generation to the next. And that's going to lead to a change in genes over time, but not necessarily to speciation. And there are some of these that lead more directly to speciation than to others. So I'm going to pop back open to the big, you know, list of everything here. And sorry, while I zoom in a little bit. All right, sorry about that pause, but I needed to check in. Okay, so the first slide here, looking at micro versus macro evolution, I just wanted to come back to this. Microevolution is what we were just talking about. All those things that violate Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium lead to microevolution, and it's evolutionary change within a lineage. That means from one generation of a group of organisms to the next, if we were to look at the DNA, look at the genes, and the versions of those genes that are coded for, you know, the frequency of brown eyes versus blue eyes, the curly hair versus dark hair, blood type, you name it, in humans, they're going to be changing slightly from one generation to the next. And this microevolution is occurring continuously. Now, if you see this third bullet point here that says a lineage may appear to remain the same over time, and this is called stasis, occasionally it looks like a population isn't changing very much at all. And some of that might be due to extreme isolation and due to a very consistent environment, and also due to a lot of connection, a lot of gene flow in the populations. So you can tell this is a really complex idea, but we can also see that microevolution is the norm, that there are changes in DNA from one generation to the next, and that leads to differences in the versions of alleles that exist. So we'll talk about macroevolution more in a few minutes when we go through those five kind of a second time with the slides. And macroevolution is by definition the origin and extinction of lineages. And basically that means does a species disappear, or is a new species formed, right? So yeah, you know, like all the species of the dinosaurs, but what happened to the Galapagos turtle? And what happened to, you know, some of the other organisms that we know about that are just plain gone, where we see them in the fossil record, or we have stuffed versions of them in natural history museums, but they're not found on the earth anymore today. And macroevolution, this the appearance and disappearance of species, it can happen you know, gradually or slowly, and it can also happen quickly depending on the extent of environmental change that occurs. So, you know, if there was, well, if there was a nuclear war, you can imagine that the extinction of lineages would happen pretty rapidly, and it would be human induced. But when the environment changes slowly over time, without any dramatic events, but with slight changes, then macroevolution and the appearance of species or the disappearance of species would be slow. You know, how long does it take for a glacier to melt and disappear? Well, if that takes thousands of years, then it takes thousands of years for the organisms that depend on the existence of glaciers to be impacted and to you know, not only evolve different genes, but maybe to not handle the fact that global warming is causing the disappearance of glaciers, and they might not survive and they might disappear too. Okay.
Would we say then, I'm sorry to interrupt, would we say then that that microevolution leads to speciation?
It does, but not always. So microevolution, there's evolutionary changes that have occurred in Homo sapiens, in humans, over generations. There are genes that we can determine are more frequent in the populations that exist today than existed a few hundred years or a few thousand years ago, but Homo sapiens is still the same species. And so there's been no speciation, but there's been microevolution. But microevolution does lead to macroevolution when there is enough change in the organisms that when the populations come back together, they're unable to have viable offspring successfully. Is that bothering you in the background? She turned on her keyboard really soft.
Not at all.
Okay, good. Then these headphones are doing their job. They're worth the $45. Okay, so when we think about microevolution, the population, not the individual, is the basic unit of change. For starters, all the changes that happen to you in your lifetime based on mutation, those are going to lead to cancer, not to something that's heritable, right? And the second thing is that if you have a change in your genes and it's passed on from one generation to the next. So it's not a change in an individual, it's a change in a group based on the genetic and the phenotypic makeup of that group, what that group looks like. And there is an example that I have, and I believe it's a little bit later on, about the peppered moth. And let me just scroll down on the left-hand side and see if it's here.
That was a really interesting thing to look at.
Okay, so if you look here on the right-hand side, you've got this light-colored moth, and then you see here where my mouse is, the dark-colored one. And then over on the left side, here's the dark-colored moth, and down right here, this is the light-colored one. So they're on trees. This tree on the left is a lichen-covered tree. This tree on the right is a soot and ash-covered tree. So in a polluted environment, the melanic or dark-winged form of this moth could hide better from birds. In a non-polluted environment, the non-pigmented, non-melanic form of this moth can hide better from birds. So during the Industrial Revolution, what happened in England? They built all these factories, and within a couple of decades, what happened is that within a couple of decades, the non-melanic form basically disappeared, but it didn't disappear entirely, and it didn't mean we had a new species of moth. It meant that those alleles were basically selected against. The homozygous recessive homozygous recessive moth is the one that couldn't hide and got eaten, okay? So in 1848, it was the melanic form, the dark form was really rare. Why? Because the trees were covered with lichen, and those dark forms stood out on the trees, and the birds could see them easily and would pick them off. And so they didn't live long enough to reproduce much. But enough of them lived that it didn't completely disappear in the population. Well, within 50 years, the melanic form increased from less than 1% of captured moths to more than 98% of the population. Well, what happened? It's not that a new species appeared, it's that there was so much pollution that darkened the trees, and the light form was really visible, and so what was getting eaten? The homozygous recessive allele version of that moth. And, you know, we're looking at a single population. So if you went, 50 miles outside the city and you looked at a different population of this species of moths, it was still like 1848. The light form was common and the melanic form was rare. And basically then clean air laws got passed, and then what happened? Another 50 years later, it switched back the other way. So there wasn't like, oh, the white moths disappeared and then the black moths disappeared. No, it was that the version of that allele, the version of the gene, the allele that codes for wing pigmentation, was selected for or against based on camouflage. And, that is a really interesting example of what we call directional selection. The environment is selecting for the non-melanic form in this non-polluted environment and against the melanic form. And when the environment changed, the melanic form was selected for and the non-melanic form was selected against. And so that's what natural selection means. How does the environment favor or disfavor a particular version of a gene? And this is a really clear-cut example of how that occurs. And so did that lead to a new species of moth? No, but it does show microevolution. Okay, so let's come back here. We've talked about So I was talking about the Hardy-Weinberg assumptions, and they're here. This is slide 7 in the PowerPoint. And basically, in order to not violate these things that are, of course, always happening, these are the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And of course, we know, as I discussed on slide 8, that the 5 ways in which Hardy-Weinberg is being met are really the 5 ways in which evolution is occurring. So the first one, I think you understand pretty well, probably from our covering chapter 9, that a mutation means one or more nucleotide bases gets changed. It gets put in wrong when the DNA is replicated, or you know, things happen. And most of the change in DNA is not inherited. It's things that damage that happens to an organism during its lifetime. But mutation that happens where one nucleotide base is changed during replication, or when one or more nucleotide bases gets like added or deleted, if it is going into DNA that is in a reproductive cell that's making gametes, then that mutation is heritable and it can be passed on to the next generation. So a heritable mutation would change one allele into another, not into a different gene. So it's not that the DNA that codes for eye color suddenly codes for 6 fingers. It's whether or not that particular gene is altered enough so that a different version of that gene is created. And a mutation would be creating an allele that is not already present in the population. So something appears that didn't exist before. So of the 5 mechanisms of evolution, mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation. If there's no mutation, then how do genes change? They wouldn't. And there's no organism that can say, I want to change, I want to mutate my DNA, I want my offspring to be different. It's not decision-based. And it's not environmentally based either, because remember, this is heritable mutation, not mutation based on radiation or any of the rest of it. So mutations are random events. Their occurrence is independent of how valuable they might be. The DNA polymerase that's putting in DNA bases doesn't have a thought process. It can't say, well, would this make a better protein? It's just random and it's rare. So this last bullet point that says mutation rates at a typical locus are about 1 in 10,000, 10 to the 6th gametes. So a 1 with 6 zeros, 1 in a million. So that means at a particular locus, meaning a particular gene, it happens about 1 in a million times. Now you have way more than one gene. So, you know, mutations can happen. It's just not like, you know, when you are creating an egg or a sperm that could be used in fertilization, that there's for sure going to be a mutation in one of your genes. There might be, but for every million sperm or eggs that are produced, there's a mutation at one in one of the genes for, you know, so if it's the gene for eye color and we looked at 1 million eggs, only one of those 1 million eggs would have a fresh mutation in it.
And do we think that all eye colors were because of mutations?
I don't know how to address that correctly.
Okay.
If you think about when a trait first appears and it's going to be a given version, then it will be the only version until there's a mutation in that gene. And then there will be a second version and so on. So I'm trying to think of how to address this simply, and I'm not sure if there's an easy way to do that. What the consensus is that when new mutations, when new things appear they are based on mutation and that it's actually pretty rare. One of the challenges that we face is we can go back in history and we can look at fossils and we can see big changes in structures, but we don't see like physiologically necessarily what changed. And you obviously can't see eye color or any of the rest of that in a fossil. And also we're limited in our ability to compare DNA in things for which it's hard to extract DNA, or the DNA may be so degraded that we just can't, right?
Yeah,
So
but in terms, yeah.
So we can look at humans or other populations and see how our DNA is changing over time. And so we see mutations that occur and that kind of get added together over time. But again, that's not necessarily leading to speciation. It's just a change in the DNA, and it might lead to a change in protein function, and it might not. A lot of the disorders that we study are inherited, and a lot of them are new or novel. My daughter's visual impairment, she has what's called optic nerve hypoplasia, and the optic nerve fibers, they grow during like the 7th and 8th week that you're pregnant, which means they're growing when you barely know that you're pregnant. And there is some die-off of those nerve fibers that's common. And when my daughter was diagnosed, she was only a few weeks old, because there was a lot of crazy circumstances surrounding her birth. So we got into some testing and some visiting doctors pretty quickly. And we enrolled her in a research study at Los Angeles Children's Hospital that she started when she was 6 months old. And the ophthalmologist who was studying this particular eye condition was asking, you know, parents and particularly moms questions and doing a survey, and they were studying the kids. And the best that they could tell at that point, and she's 14 now, so 14 years ago, was that they thought there was a genetic component, but they didn't think it was heritable. They thought it was a new mutation that led to the underproduction of optic nerve fibers. And so the connection between her occipital lobes, which interpret vision, and her eyes, where the messages go back and forth, the nerve fiber production was either really low or there was an excessive die-off or both, but my eyes are fine, so how could it be heritable? So they didn't think it was heritable. They thought it was a new gene mutation, but they had no idea what gene. And when we do this class, like in person, we do a genetics research project where I have students study a genetically inherited disorder in humans, but you know, we didn't do that this term. So
is this mutations basically saying that the reason we look different in terms of curly and straight hair is because of genetic variation, or is there, like, I guess, I don't know, maybe that's just a question for me to ponder on my own, but
it's sort of what came first, the chicken or the egg. We don't know which came first, curly hair or straight hair, but we know that there is a gene that codes for, well, there's more than one gene that codes for hair texture, but this particular one codes for curly or straight. And in order to get two different versions, I don't know which version existed first, but there's two different proteins that are coded for by this gene, and one codes for curly and one codes for straight. And when you get two of them together, you have wavy. And I wouldn't be surprised that if there's like multiple genes that are working on, you know, hair texture together, because, you know, we think about thickness and the amount of hair follicles and length of hair, you know, so there are genes that are going to control all of that, but also not everybody's hair texture is exactly the same. So yeah, there's a lot you could do. You could take a couple of genetics courses and go way into this. So mutations, source of genetic variation, and it has to be mutations in gametes to be heritable. The second one, allele flow. So this, I borrowed this image from Wikipedia, and picture these two populations of birds. They're the same species, but the reason they're red and they're blue is to show you that they're separated from each other by this mountain. And so it's really hard for boys and girls of this species to get together and have offspring together. Well, what happens if a bird from one side of the mountain is able to get to the other side and reproduce? Then what does it contribute to that population that it now resides in? It brings the alleles that it had that might be a little bit different. You know, yes, still coding for 2 feet, but what color of 2 feet, right? Yes, still coding for a beak, but what length of beak, what depth of beak? And so allele flow is this movement of genes from one population to another that's based on the ability of populations to be connected, okay? So the more connected a population is, often that means the alleles are conserved in both populations, and it tends to actually reduce the rate of evolution into new species. So if you reduce gene flow by isolating populations, then it's easier for a mutation that happens in one side to become more predominant. And then after many generations, if you were to introduce those two populations back together again, they might not be able to mate successfully. And that's essentially what happened on the Galapagos. That's why all those finches are considered, you know, subspecies, because they look different, they eat different food, they mate at different times, and they don't have offspring together. The third one, natural selection, we've been over a lot, and natural selection is basically what does the environment favor as far as a particular set of genes that an organism has. You saw with the peppered moth, which when the environment changed, a different version of a gene was favored over another one. And so natural selection acts on phenotypes, the expression of a particular set of genes. So phenotypes are determined by genotype and how the environment impacts it. And so natural selection works on those phenotypes. Okay, so how can we get change from one generation to the next in the alleles in a population? Well, if every bird was exactly the same and had all the same genes and there were no alternate versions, would there be any difference between those birds? No, they'd essentially be clones, and there'd be nothing for the environment to act on. So in order for selection to occur, the alleles actually have to be different. There has to be variation in genes. And some of that variation has to actually be important for survival. So, you know, does how cute your, you know, the shape of your fingers are actually impact your survival and your ability to reproduce? No, so it's not going to lead to natural selection. It's just natural variation in the population. So natural selection is differential survival based on traits that the environment favors or disfavors. And the next slide says, okay, so what happens if what's common in the population, which would be the peak, shifts one direction or the other? So over time, the weight of human babies has shifted from lighter to heavier, and some of that is maternal health, and some of it is our ability to care for babies. Sometimes, some of it's, you know, babies being born to term, and it's just that the weight of babies has shifted, and so we say that there's been directional selection in the human population for the trait of birth weight. When we look at these fossil shells, we can actually see that the amount, the way that the ribbing, the sectioning on these shells, we can actually see the shells look different over time, and for some reason, having less striping and roughness on the shells was somehow better for survival. And so we see a change in the fossils through time. And that's just an example of selection toward a particular variation of the shells. So I went through the peppered moths. Stabilizing selection is when we select for a norm over an extreme. A norm for birth weight that's maybe higher than it was a few centuries ago, but not 12-pound babies and not 2-pound babies. We still have stabilizing selection, where a baby is much more likely to survive if it has an intermediate weight as opposed to being really heavy or really tiny. Obviously, technology has changed that slightly, but it's still stabilizing selection. The finches, they're an example of different types of selection. Let's see here. Disruptive selection is when we kind of get two groups of a population that are favored, but the intermediate is not favored. And we'll look at this in the learning assignment in a few minutes. Okay, number 4, genetic drift that I talked about. It's totally random. It means that what happens if a rare allele just doesn't make it into an egg that gets fertilized by a sperm, and it's an egg that doesn't, and so it could randomly disappear. So the smaller a population is, the more likely it is that a rare allele could just plain disappear, because an organism with that rare allele didn't get the chance to mate, or when it did mate, the rare allele just didn't get selected for. So think about in humans, how rare is it to have 6 fingers? And it's not like if you met somebody with 6 fingers, you refuse to have their child, but maybe several hundred years ago it was the case. And so it's just something that's sort of been slightly selected out of the population. But more likely it's genetic drift, where if you only need one dominant allele to have 6 fingers, and so you are a heterozygote, then you will actually, you know, you have a 50-50 chance that your 6-fingered allele gets passed on and a 50-50 chance that it does not. And if randomly it just doesn't, then it's more likely to disappear, okay? Boredom. Here comes summer, right? Okay, we're recording again. So this diagram shows you if there were 4 versions of a given gene, and we looked at how common they were, and we ran a computer simulation many times, often the alleles just flat out disappear randomly in the population. And it's not because the environment favors or disfavors them, it's just because they are rare and they just randomly don't make it into eggs and sperm that turn into offspring. Okay, I'm gonna skip past founder effect and bottleneck are specific cases of genetic drift, where basically when a population breaks off of a big group and becomes a small population, whether it's a natural disaster or a huge predation event or something like that, then, or a big extinction event, then the population that's left, this little small subpopulation, well, what alleles does it have? Just the ones in that small group. And so the founder effect is what you get when the few individuals are separated from the original allele pool and make a new population. You only get what's there. So the California condor population is really low. And it was even worse 20, 30 years ago. And a lot of that had to do with DDT and with lead poisoning, where a lot of the birds got sick and died, in addition to, you know, them just getting shot and loss of habitat. And so we took a lot of the few condors that were left and put them in a breeding program. But how many alleles for a particular trait would a small population actually have compared to the original population with hundreds of thousands of birds? And so what we say is that the founder effect happened. So it's genetic drift that happens when you end up with a small chunk of a population that's left. And a bottleneck is similar, and it's basically what happens when a population is really close to extinction. and there aren't very many individuals left, and it would be very easy for rare alleles to just vanish. And so the population that's left has very similar genetic traits. Okay, and do we need to go over number 5? Does it make sense that non-random mating is very rare in
Yeah,
most
makes
organisms? Sense. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not just humans, you know, peacocks have a plan for, you know, that male bird's, you know, big fan looking better. So there's assortative mating when individuals choose their mates based on, you know, resemblance to each other, or, you know, based on, you know, whether or not you look like you'd make a good dad or a mom, right? So now we're down to macroevolution, which is what I mentioned before, is what happens when how do we get a new taxonomic group? Is it because the original group went extinct and all we have is this group with the new variations, or do the two groups branch off? And the biological definition of a species is a population or an interconnected group of populations where those individuals, if they were actually given the chance to mate and have offspring, would be able to do so, and that the offspring that they produce would be viable, meaning that they would live and be able to reproduce themselves. So you can have, what is it, a donkey and a horse mate, but the offspring will live, but it's sterile. And so you can't make a new species from mating a donkey and a horse, because the offspring can't actually reproduce themselves. So there's a couple of types of ways a new species originates, and these terms anagenesis and cladogenesis sound difficult, but genesis just means something new, the birth of something new, and anagenesis, it just refers to, does microevolution accumulate to the point that two populations that became isolated become so different that they, oh, I just misspoke. Anagenesis is basically when there's so much accumulation of mutation that a new population, a population becomes a new species. And cladogenesis is basically when the original species still exists, but there's enough mutation in a particular group that those two groups no longer can reproduce successfully. So if you look at this one, if we look through like the fossil record and we can see a version that exists now that's different than the version that exists before, and the version that exists before is gone, we call that anagenesis. And if we can see, okay, the version that exists today existed before, but there's also this new one that's a little bit different, then we call that cladogenesis. And a clade refers to the phylogenetic tree, this branching based on, you know, comparing anatomy and comparing DNA, where organisms that are close together on this branching tree are closely related behaviorally and genetically. So what would happen if you have this group of trees and there's enough erosion of a river that it creates a canyon that separates them? Anybody ever been to the Grand Canyon? Is the stuff on the north side exactly the same as the stuff on the south side? What about if you looked at the insects and the, you know, the rodents in the burrows? So this picture actually shows it with trees, and it's saying, all right, if you have a big geographical divide, you can get a new species that exists. And you know, what would we call that one? Well, the original species exists and the new species exists, but it's based on a geographical divide. So we would call this cladogenesis, but we would also call it allopatric speciation because it was a geographic change that occurred. And then this one, sympatric speciation. Look, there's no geographical change, but we have this group where they have enough mutations that a new thing appears that's different. And so we'd be looking here, you know, at cladogenesis also. And then I'm gonna scroll back a little bit, scroll forward. I mean, there's a summary of some things that, impact the rate of speciation. So what happens if, two populations look like they could be compatible? What keeps brown squirrels and black squirrels, or squirrels and chipmunks, from mating and having offspring, right? Well, what if they don't live in the same exact habitat and they hardly ever see each other? Then they're not likely to mate and reproduce, right? What happens if, even if they could successfully mate, the fertilized egg is not viable? Well, that would be that would be a problem where there's no viability of the embryo. What happens if two different groups of insects live on a particular bush, but where they hang out on the bush is different, or what times they hang out on the bush is different? Well, then they don't encounter each other, and then they can't, they can't mate. And my funny example is that when my husband and I were newly married, his shift changed and we had a daughter. And this doesn't directly apply to speciation, of course, but it sort of gets the point across. I was teaching during the day and taking care of our daughter, and school would get out at 2:50, and I would walk in the door at 3:05, and I would kiss him goodbye, and he would go to work until 12:30 in the morning. So we never saw each other. We basically experienced behavioral and habitat isolation. We supposedly lived in the same house, but we never saw each other except for rarely, for the course of several months. Well, extrapolate that out to organisms that live in the same habitat, but they don't use the habitat in the same way, and maybe they don't use the habitat at the same times of day. So they're not going to see each other, and they're not going to therefore mate and have offspring. And so that would be, before there's any fertilization, there's barriers to mating. And then post-zygotic would be, well, let's say they do have the opportunity to mate, but the offspring, for multiple reasons listed here, just aren't viable, meaning either the fertilized egg can't survive, or even if it does, it can't have offspring of its own, like I was mentioning with the donkey and the horse, is this B version right here. So speciation basically is, we have to have members of a population or connected populations be able not only to mate successfully, but to reproduce successfully. And that's the definition of biological speciation. So how often do we get a new species? How often do we get a new species? Well, the gradualism model says, hey, slowly over time we get new species, and it's always happening. The punctuated equilibrium model says, well, most of the time we're not getting anything new, but every now and again the environment changes drastically, and we get a new species that appears in evolutionary time. And believe it or not, the fossil record gives evidence of both of these. They're both conceptually accurate. They're just not happening, mutually exclusive of the other. And the reason Darwin, missed this macroevolution bit is he was just one guy without DNA, without chromosomes, without an understanding of meiosis. And he didn't see much in his lifespan, because humans tend to live, 100 years or less. And how long does it take for a new species to occur or appear? Generally hundreds and thousands of years. And so we usually don't live long enough to see, punctuated equilibrium occur, or even to see gradualism yield a new species. So that was the PowerPoint. And I'm going to come over here, and let's just take 5 minutes to talk about the last learning assignment. And Model 1 goes through the 3 types of selection: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. So this is all natural selection, but it says, okay, what happens if we shift towards a different middle ground, well, then we call that directional. What happens if instead of the middle ground, the two extremes become more favored? That's disruptive. And what happens if we get a tighter group in the middle that is normal? That's what we'd call stabilizing selection. So what do all of these variables compare? They're looking at how the environment selects for the traits in the subsequent generation. So it's looking at the impact of the environment on traits or natural selection. So what are the three types of selection? You just have to rewrite them down, all the titles that are there. That's number 2. And number 3, according to the graphs, there's variation in the body mass in the original population, using your knowledge of genetics to describe how this variation is possible. Do you remember when we were talking about beak depth? Well, just like the different habitats might favor a particular beak type, well, could different parts of the environment favor smaller rats versus larger rats? And so the body mass might be affected depending on the exact neighborhood in which a rat resides. And so there are genes that code for, you know, body size in rats. And oh, by the way, how many of you know people who are all the exact same height and weight as you as opposed to being different? Well, we know that our genes play a role in our phenotype. And so that's how that variation would be possible. Okay, when you look at graph A, it says, let me see, can I do a side-by-side view? 2-page view, that's what I want. Okay, so number 4 says, look at graph A and how did the population experience selection different from the original population? So the original is this dashed line and the population after the selection. So if we look at this graph A, it looks like the heavier or bigger body mass was selected for as more favorable. And so the population is different in that the population overall is heavier. B, fitness is the ability of an individual to survive, reproduce, and pass on genes. So which individuals in the original population appear to display better fitness? And it would be those who have a bigger body size were more likely to survive, live long enough to have offspring, and so that's fitness. And so their alleles stayed in the population, and the skinnier, lighter weight ones didn't, and so those alleles started to disappear. So I want you to think through some characteristics in the environment that might lead to those population changes. Think about, like, say, fish. Do you think a female fish is more likely to mate with the puny, skinny male fish or the buff male fish? And what would that do toward the size of the population over time? So just one idea to think about. B has you think about, oh, sorry, we're going to lose it. B asks about the difference, and as I went over, skinnier, lighter weight, and heavier are selected for as opposed to this intermediate, okay? And so those are the groups that have better fitness. And I want you to think about some characteristics of the environment that might lead to the changes in graph B. What happens if the big ones can really fight well and the little ones can hide, but the middle-sized ones can't do either very well? That would be an example. And then 6 just asks you to think about what would lead to stabilizing selection. Well, what if it was harder to survive if you were skinny and harder to survive if you had to eat tons of food every day? And, you know, so this would be true for a rat population and for lots of different organisms. So I want you to think about what might change in the environment that might lead to changes. And when I think about changes in the environment, think about if there was a drought Think about if there was a flood. Think about if there were new predators or fewer predators, or a disease. Those are all changes in the environment that might cause selection to occur. So see if you think any of those are applicable to A, B, and C. And so then you basically have to redefine in your own words directional and disruptive selection. And then, sorry, I'm looking for where we are. That's number 7. So now we're on number 8. And then basically you have some scenarios for number 8 here on the right-hand side for what you think might happen based on these changes in environmental pressure. So if you're a finch with a small beak and you can't crack open seeds, well, you're not going to get enough food to have babies. And so then what happens to birds with small beaks? Well, if they don't reproduce, then this small beaked version disappears. Humans with very high or very low birth weights have a higher mortality rate. Well, that's going to be stabilizing selection because it's going to be the intermediate baby weight that gets selected for. C, the seed cracker finches. Well, if the seeds are only small or large, then the birds that have intermediate beak size are probably not going to compete very well for either the small or the large seeds, and so then we'd see directional selection. And then the very last one, overfishing. Well, if we prefer to catch the big fish, then what's going to happen to the population over time? It's actually going to shrink. Probably shrink in size and shrink in numbers as well. So that was the assignment. And